In the autumn of 1884, in a gas-lit committee room on the second floor of the State War and Navy Building in Washington, a delegate from the Ottoman Empire discovered something in the conference minutes that contradicted the official agenda. The typed schedule claimed the session would address technical coordination of longitudinal measurement. Yet, in the margins of a preliminary document circulated 3 days prior, someone had written in pencil, "Prime matter settled, remaining sessions theater only." The delegate, whose name appears in no official record, noted the discrepancy in his personal journal, which surfaced in an Istanbul archive in 1967. By the time the International Meridian Conference concluded on the first day of November, 25 nations had agreed to reset the world's understanding of time itself. The official explanation emphasized scientific progress and navigational accuracy. The crossed-out paragraphs and marginal annotations suggest something more calculated was at work. The room measured 42 feet by 31. Autumn light filtered through tall windows facing Pennsylvania Avenue, casting elongated shadows across mahogany tables arranged in a hollow square. A pendulum clock mounted on the east wall ticked audibly between statements, its mechanism visible through a glass panel. The temperature held at 61 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by coal-burning radiators that occasionally hissed and settled. Stenographers positioned at corner desks transcribed every formal statement, their pens scratching against paper in rhythmic patterns that created a low, ambient sound beneath the proceedings. Outside, the streets were wet from morning rain. Inside, delegates wore wool suits that retained the smell of pipe smoke and damp fabric. The air felt close, despite the high ceilings. On the conference's opening day, October 13th, the American delegation distributed a proposal that had been finalized only 18 hours earlier. The document bore signs of hasty revision, ink still faintly damp on certain pages, corrections made in what appeared to be 3 different hands. The proposal advocated for Greenwich, England, as the world's prime meridian, the 0 point from which all longitude would be measured. The stated rationale emphasized that 65% of global shipping already used British nautical charts. Yet a French delegate's personal correspondence, discovered in Paris Municipal Archives in 1993, describes a private dinner on October 11th where the American position was already determined beyond revision. The official record shows 2 days of deliberation. The correspondence suggests the outcome was negotiated before the conference formally convened. The concept of a prime meridian was not new. For centuries, maritime nations had calculated longitude from their own capitals or major observatories. Paris, Cadiz, Rome, Copenhagen, Stockholm, each maintained its own 0 point. A ship's captain crossing the Atlantic might consult 3 different charts, each placing the same coastal landmark at different longitudinal coordinates. The resulting confusion was more than inconvenient. In an era when international telegraph networks were expanding rapidly and railroad schedules crossed national borders, the lack of a unified system created measurable friction in commerce, communication, and military coordination. The conference was convened, ostensibly, to resolve this inefficiency through international consensus. Yet the Greenwich proposal faced immediate opposition. France, which had advocated for Paris as the natural prime meridian since the 17th century, presented counter-arguments grounded in mathematical elegance and historical precedent. The French delegation proposed a neutral meridian, one passing through no major nation's territory, perhaps through the Bering Strait or the mid-Atlantic. This would avoid, they argued, giving any single empire undue symbolic authority over global timekeeping. The suggestion was technically sound. It was also, several delegates noted privately, strategically impossible. Britain's Royal Navy dominated the seas. British cartographers had produced the most comprehensive nautical charts in existence. Any neutral meridian would require decades of remapping and recalibration, during which the existing British system would continue to function as the de facto standard. On October 18th, a Saturday, the conference did not meet. Several delegates visited the U.S. Naval Observatory, situated on a hill northwest of Georgetown. The observatory housed a transit circle, a precision telescope mounted to swing only along the celestial meridian, used to determine exact time by observing star transits. The instrument was manufactured in Munich, calibrated in Greenwich, and operated by American astronomers who had trained at European institutions. A photograph from that visit, held in the Library of Congress, shows 9 men in dark coats standing beside the telescope housing. 2 are pointing upward. 1 holds a pocket watch. In the background, barely visible, a chalkboard displays calculations related to telegraph signal delays between Washington and Greenwich. The calculations are dated October 7th, 6 days before the conference officially began. When sessions resumed on Monday, October 20th, the debate shifted from which meridian to adopt to how time itself would be subdivided. The British proposed dividing the globe into 24 time zones, each spanning 15 degrees of longitude, similarly 50 minutes in each 1 hour apart. This was presented as logical and uniform. Yet the proposal contained an asymmetry. The prime meridian would run through Greenwich, meaning British Standard Time would become the reference point for the entire system. Every other zone would be defined as hours ahead of or hours behind Greenwich Mean Time. The French delegate objected, stating that this gave Britain not just a symbolic advantage but a practical one. British financiers and military coordinators would operate from the Temporal Center, while other nations would constantly adjust to British time. The stenographic record shows the French objection was acknowledged and then redirected. The American chair suggested forming a subcommittee to study the time zone question separately from the prime meridian question. The subcommittee met twice, on October 22nd and 24th. No minutes from these meetings appear in the official conference proceedings. However, a State Department memorandum dated October 25th, discovered in 2003 during a routine archive digitization project, summarizes the subcommittee's work as concluded satisfactorily, with understanding reached on principal concerns. The memorandum is signed with initials that do not match any official delegate roster. By October 28th, 3 days before the conference's scheduled conclusion, the essential framework was settled. The time of Greenwich would be the prime meridian. The globe would be divided into time zones based on Greenwich Mean Time. Ships, railroads, and telegraph networks worldwide would synchronize to this system. The final vote was scheduled for November 1st. In the intervening days, delegates attended receptions, toured government buildings, and drafted final reports. The official narrative describes this period as one of diplomatic courtesy and procedural formality. Personal letters from delegates describe something else. A Brazilian representative wrote to his foreign minister that the outcome had been evident from the first morning. A Japanese delegate noted in his diary that the conference serves to ratify what British influence already accomplished. A Spanish delegate described the proceedings as theater staged for the public, while the script was written months ago. The vote itself was anticlimactic. 22 nations voted in favor of the Greenwich Meridian. 1 nation, San Domingo, voted against. 2 abstained, France and Brazil. The French delegate stated for the record that France could not endorse a system that elevated one nation's observatory above all others, but would comply in practice. Brazil's delegate cited concerns about time zone implementation affecting domestic railroad schedules. Both objections were noted and set aside. The resolution passed. Outside, the afternoon was clear and cold. The temperature had dropped to 48 degrees. A light wind carried the smell of burning coal from nearby government buildings. The stenographers collected their notes. The clock on the wall showed 3:47 p.m., Eastern Standard Time, a designation that would, within a decade, be synchronized to Greenwich. But something peculiar appears in the conference's supplementary documents. On October 30th, the day before the final vote, a resolution was proposed regarding the Universal Day. This proposal suggested that a single calendar day should begin at the same moment worldwide, specifically at midnight in Greenwich. Simultaneously used to create what was termed a cosmic day for scientific and astronomical purposes. The resolution was discussed for 43 minutes. Then it was tabled indefinitely. The official record states the matter was deemed premature for present consideration. Yet the discussion reveals an underlying tension. If time zones were adopted, each zone would experience midnight at a different moment. A ship crossing the Pacific would pass through dates that technically overlapped or skipped. The system being created was not mathematically consistent with a unified cosmic day. It was instead a practical compromise that prioritized railroad schedules and commercial coordination over astronomical precision. A marginal note in the Ottoman delegates' journal, written on October 30th, reads, "They solve a problem they created, Before railroads, each town kept its own time. Now they impose one time to serve railroad investors. They call this progress. The note is brief but pointed. The conference did not discover a natural law. It constructed a convention that served specific commercial and imperial interests. The fact that the convention was useful, that synchronized time zones did facilitate trade, communication, and navigation, does not erase the question of whose interests were served first, indeed. The decades following the conference, most nations adopted the Greenwich system. France held out until 1911, officially using Paris Mean Time retarded by 9 minutes 21 seconds, a formula that avoided directly referencing Greenwich while conforming to the practical standard. Russia adopted time zones in 1919, after the revolution. China, which geographically spans 5 time zones, operated on a single national time beginning in 1912, creating the peculiar result that sunrise in western China occurs near midday by the clock. Japan adopted the system in 1888, aligning itself with the emerging global order. By 1929, nearly every nation on Earth used Greenwich Mean Time as the baseline for civil timekeeping. Yet the system's adoption was never purely technical. In British India, the introduction of standardized time zones in the 1880s met resistance from local communities whose agricultural and religious practices were tied to solar time. A report from the Bombay Presidency, dated 1887, describes disputes over railway schedules that forced farmers to adjust planting and harvest routines to match train departures. The report frames this as a temporary inconvenience, necessary for modernization. Oral histories collected in the 1960s describe it differently, as an imposed reordering of daily life to serve commercial timetables set in London. The trains ran on time, the fields did not. In North America, the adoption of time zones was driven by railroad companies, not governments. On November 18, 1883, 10 months before the International Meridian Conference, American and Canadian railroads unilaterally implemented a 4-zone system for the continent. The zones were not based on international agreement. They were based on operational necessity. Railroad companies needed to print consistent schedules. The public needed to know when trains would arrive. On that Sunday in November, telegraph operators across the continent synchronized their clocks to match the new zones. Cities adjusted their public clocks, sometimes over the objections of local officials who resented railroad companies dictating municipal time. The change was swift and largely irreversible. By the time the International Meridian Conference convened the following year, the American railroad system had already imposed its own temporal order. A photograph from the Chicago Union Station, dated November 1883, shows a clock face being adjusted by workers on a ladder. A crowd has gathered below, watching. Some wear pocket watches. One man holds a stopwatch. The image captures a moment of transition. The old local time being erased. Time 3:50. The new railroad time being installed. The clock's hands are blurred, caught mid-movement. The workers' faces are sharp and focused. In the bottom left corner, partially visible, someone has written on a wall in chalk, "Who owns the hours?" The writing appears fresh, not yet smudged by weather or time. The conference proceedings never mention the railroad companies directly. The official language speaks of improved navigation, scientific coordination, and international harmony. But the timing is suggestive. Railroads needed synchronized time to function profitably. Telegraph networks needed unified reference points to coordinate signals, global. Shipping needed standardized charts to reduce navigational errors. These were not abstract scientific goals. They were commercial imperatives. The conference transformed these imperatives into international law, cloaking private interests in the language of public good. On November 1, 1884, as delegates departed Washington, a brief article appeared in the Evening Star newspaper. The article described the conference as a triumph of reason over tradition, science over superstition. It praised the delegates for bringing order to the chaos of temporal measurement. The article did not mention the French abstention, the crossed-out paragraphs, or the private negotiations that preceded the public sessions. It did not question why Greenwich, rather than a neutral meridian, had been selected. It presented the outcome as inevitable and beneficial, a necessary step in humanity's march toward modernity. Yet in the decades that followed, the conference's legacy grew more complex. During World War I, nations began manipulating time zones for strategic purposes. Germany introduced daylight saving time in 1916 to conserve coal for the war effort. Britain followed weeks later. The practice spread rapidly, but not uniformly. Each nation set its own schedule for when clocks would spring forward and fall back. The result was a patchwork of shifting time zones that contradicted the very standardization the 1884 conference had sought to achieve. Time, it turned out, was too useful a tool to leave purely to international agreement. Nations would adjust it as needed for war, for agriculture, for energy conservation, for economic advantage. In the Soviet Union, experiments with time grew stranger still. In 1929, the government introduced a 5-day workweek, with each day named by number rather than traditional names. The goal was to keep factories running continuously, with different workers resting on different days. The system lasted 2 years before being abandoned as unworkable. In 1930, the USSR adopted permanent daylight saving time, moving clocks forward and never moving them back. In 1981, they added another hour, creating double summer time. Workers lived 2 hours ahead of solar time year-round. The policy was framed as progressive, a demonstration that socialist planning could master even temporal rhythm. In practice, it disrupted sleep patterns, confused international coordination, and was quietly reversed after the Soviet collapse. These experiments reveal something the 1884 conference obscured. Time is not a neutral measurement. It is a social construct, subject to political manipulation and economic pressure. The Greenwich system succeeded not because it was scientifically superior, a neutral meridian would have worked equally well, but because it aligned with existing power structures. Britain's naval dominance, commercial reach, and cartographic infrastructure made Greenwich the practical choice. The conference ratified this reality while presenting it as objective necessity. In 1972, nearly 90 years after the conference, the world adopted Coordinated Universal Time, or UTC. This system replaced Greenwich Mean Time as the international standard but retained Greenwich as the reference meridian. The change was technical, involving atomic clocks and leap seconds to account for Earth's irregular rotation. The symbolic geography remained unchanged. Zero longitude still runs through Greenwich. UTC is still, functionally, British time with a different name. The legacy of 1884 persists, encoded in the infrastructure of global communication, navigation, and commerce. Yet something curious has emerged in recent years. With the rise of digital networks and satellite systems, physical location has become less relevant to timekeeping. Computers synchronize to atomic clocks via internet protocols. GPS satellites broadcast time signals independent of time zones. Financial markets operate on servers that use UTC internally, time 3 CMs, while displaying local time to users. The system is simultaneously more precise and more arbitrary than anything the 1884 delegates could have imagined. We have standardized time to the nanosecond, while rendering its geographic basis largely irrelevant. On September 22, 2019, a software engineer in Singapore notices an anomaly in server logs. Timestamps for transactions between Tokyo and London show microsecond discrepancies that should not exist given network speeds and atomic clock synchronization. The discrepancies are tiny, measured in millionths of a second, but persistent. After 3 weeks of investigation, the cause is traced to leap-second implementation differences between operating systems. One system added the leap second at midnight UTC. Another added it at the moment of the actual astronomical event. The difference created temporal overlaps lasting 0.000023 seconds, during which 2 moments briefly existed simultaneously in different parts of the network. The engineer files a bug report. It is marked as low priority. The system works well enough for practical purposes. The fact that time itself occasionally forks and rejoins at microsecond scales is noted as a curiosity, not a problem. No one suggests reconvening an international conference to address it. The 1884 solution, agreeing on a single reference point, time 400 MST, remains in place, even as the technology has evolved beyond the framework the delegates could have conceived. In a climate-controlled archive beneath Paris, the original French delegation's notes from the 1884 conference rest in acid-free folders. The pages are fragile, yellowed at the edges, covered in handwriting that shifts from formal to hurried as the conference progressed. One page contains a sketch, a circle divided into 24 segments, like a pie chart. At the top, someone has written Greenwich with a line through it. Below, in smaller script, Paris retardé. Below that, time, 50 spies smaller still, l'heure n'appartient à personne. Time belongs to no one. The sketch was never shown to the conference. It was never incorporated into the official record. It exists as a fragment, a glimpse of what was considered and rejected. The French delegation knew they would lose the vote. They knew Greenwich would be adopted. They sketched alternatives anyway, preserving in their notes what could not be preserved in policy. The act of documentation was, perhaps, its own form of resistance, a way of insisting that other possibilities had existed, even if they were not chosen. Today, the phrase coordinated universal time appears on millions of screens daily. Airline schedules, stock tickers, international broadcasts, satellite data, all reference UTC, as if it were a natural feature of reality, rather than a convention established by political negotiation in 1884. The system works because we collectively agree it works. The agreement is so complete that questioning it seems absurd. Yet the historical record shows the agreement was neither inevitable nor neutral. It was the result of specific actors pursuing specific interests at a specific moment when technological change made global time coordination both possible and profitable. If history is written by those who control the clocks, the 1884 International Meridian Conference was the moment that control became global. The delegates departed Washington believing they had solved a technical problem. They had done something more. They had encoded into international law a temporal order that served the needs of industrial capitalism, imperial administration, and military coordination. The clocks still run on that order. The fact that we no longer notice it, that we take synchronized time as given, is perhaps the conference's greatest achievement. What was once imposed has become invisible, transformed from convention into common sense, from political decision into natural law. The stenographic record ends with a procedural note. Time 50 msiu. Conference adjourned sine die, November 1st, 1884, 4:12 p.m. The clock on the wall ticked forward. The delegates filed out. The world reset its clocks and moved on.